It feels as vivid as if it happened just yesterday. My husband, David, and I were seated in our snug living room, enjoying the kind of evening where the world seems still, the only sounds being the crackle of the fireplace and the occasional rustle of a blanket. We had been married for 10 years, a decade of ups, downs, and everything in between. David was my closest confidant, my source of strength, and my partner in all things, or so I believed. That evening, David gave me a look I couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't anger or sorrow, but there was something off about it. Clearing his throat, he spoke. "Honey, there's something I've been thinking about." I instinctively braced myself, expecting the usual topics: bills, work-related stress, or maybe even a surprise vacation, though that last one was wishful thinking. Instead, his next words made my stomach drop. "What would you think about spending time with someone else?" His voice was calm, but his eyes didn't meet mine. I let out a nervous laugh, waiting for him to reveal the joke. "Spending time, you mean like with friends?" "No," he replied firmly, finally meeting my gaze. "I mean, what if you connected with another man just for one night?" For a moment, I thought I must have misheard him. This was David, the same man who once got jealous because a waiter smiled too warmly while taking my order. And now he was suggesting, what exactly? I felt my face grow hot. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Leaning forward, David's tone softened, but there was an insistence to it. "I've been reading about something couples do. They bring someone else into their relationship, you know, to keep things exciting." My stomach churned. Keep things exciting? Was he bored? Did he think I wasn't enough? And then, just when I thought I couldn't be more stunned, he added, "There's this guy I know, Jerome. We work out at the same gym. I think he'd be perfect." I stared at him, utterly speechless. Jerome, a man I'd only seen in passing. He was tall, self-assured, and had a presence that demanded attention wherever he went. "David, have you completely lost your mind?" I snapped, standing so quickly that the blanket draped over me fell to the floor. "This is insane." But David didn't back down. His demeanor remained unsettlingly calm. "Just think about it," he urged. "I wouldn't bring this up if I didn't believe it could bring us closer." "Closer?" I shot back, incredulous. "How on earth could something like this bring us closer?" My mind was a whirlwind of emotions: shock, disbelief, anger, and even a flicker of curiosity I wasn't ready to admit. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, unable to escape David's words. What did this mean for our marriage? Was this the beginning of the end, or was there something I wasn't seeing? David didn't mention it again in the days that followed, but his suggestion lingered in the air like an unspoken secret. Just when I began convincing myself it was a passing phase, Jerome appeared in a way I hadn't anticipated. Time passed, and I told myself David's idea was a fleeting thought, something he'd forget once reality set in. Then, on a quiet Saturday morning, David announced, "Jerome's coming over for dinner tonight." I froze mid-sip of my coffee. What? He mentioned he hasn't had a home-cooked meal since moving here, David explained, his tone overly cheerful. I thought it'd be nice to invite him over. No pressure, of course, just dinner. No pressure, I muttered under my breath, feeling both irritated and uneasy. This wasn't just dinner. It felt like a test, a way for David to plant the seeds of his absurd idea. That evening, I found myself nervously chopping vegetables in the kitchen, mentally preparing for the awkwardness ahead. When the doorbell rang, I heard David's booming voice as he greeted Jerome like an old friend. Stepping out of the kitchen to say hello, I stopped in my tracks. Jerome was even more striking up close. Broad shoulders, an air of confidence, and a warm smile that lingered just a bit too long. "Hi," I said, forcing a polite smile. "Pleasure to finally meet you," Jerome replied, his deep voice smooth as he extended a hand. His grip was firm, and for a fleeting moment, I felt a spark I couldn't quite explain. Dinner was surprisingly enjoyable. Jerome was funny, charming, and had an effortless way of drawing everyone into the conversation. He spoke about his work as a fitness trainer, his passion for cooking, a detail David had conveniently left out, and his upbringing in a small southern town. David, unusually quiet, watched our interaction with an intensity that put me on edge. I tried to focus on being a good hostess, but I couldn't ignore how Jerome's attention lingered on me. He complimented my cooking, asked about my hobbies, and laughed just a little too enthusiastically at my jokes. When Jerome finally left, David turned to me with a knowing look. "He's a great guy, isn't he?" I crossed my arms, glaring. "Don't start, David. It was just dinner." Unfazed, David pressed on. "You two got along really well. You see what I mean now? This doesn't have to be a bad thing." I shook my head, unable to believe what I was hearing. "Do you even hear yourself? You're practically throwing me at another man." David sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm not throwing you at anyone. I want us to be happy, to try something new. Jerome isn't a stranger anymore. He's someone we can trust." His words hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. I didn't know what frightened me more, David's persistence or the tiny, shameful part of me that wondered what it might be like to step outside the boundaries of our carefully constructed life. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a message. It was from Jerome. "Thanks for the great dinner last night. David's lucky to have you." I stared at the screen, my heart racing. Why was he texting me directly? And why did his words make me feel something? I told myself it was harmless, a polite thank you. But deep down, I knew it was more complicated than that. Jerome's message lingered in my mind all day. It wasn't the words themselves. They were innocent enough. It was the way they made me feel, noticed, appreciated, seen. At first, I didn't reply, convincing myself it was better to leave it alone. But by lunchtime, curiosity got the better of me. I sent a short response. Thanks for coming over. Glad you enjoyed it. It seemed harmless, right? Just a friendly thank you. But when Jerome replied almost instantly with, "You're an amazing host. Can't wait to hang out again," I felt a flicker of guilt. David had no idea Jerome and I were texting. While I wasn't hiding it exactly, I wasn't rushing to tell him either. A week later, David brought up Jerome again while we were driving to the store. "You know," he said casually, "Jerome mentioned you guys had a good chat over dinner." Gripping the steering wheel a little tighter, I kept my eyes on the road. "It was just small talk," I said, trying to sound indifferent. David nodded but didn't let it drop. He said, "You're easy to talk to." Thought that was nice. I couldn't tell if he was fishing for something or genuinely trying to ease me into his bizarre idea. Either way, I wasn't biting. Later that week, Jerome texted again, this time about a new recipe he was trying. "Thought of you since you're such a great cook. Want the recipe?" It seemed harmless, so I said yes. One recipe turned into a conversation about food, then into stories about his childhood. Before I knew it, we'd been texting for over an hour. I told myself it was fine. David trusted Jerome, and it's not like anything was happening. But when Jerome texted, "Wish I had a cook like you around all the time," I found myself staring at the screen, unsure of how to respond. Was he flirting, or was I reading too much into it? The real shock came a few days later. David came home and handed me his phone. "Jerome wants to invite us to his place for dinner this weekend," he said, grinning. I hesitated, unsure of what to say. If I declined, it might make things awkward. But if I agreed, I didn't know how I'd handle being around Jerome with David there. "Sure," I said finally, forcing a smile. "Why not?" That Saturday, we arrived at Jerome's sleek apartment, its modern design bathed in warm evening light. Dinner was delicious, Jerome's cooking as impressive as he'd promised. But there was a tension beneath the surface I couldn't ignore. Every time Jerome's eyes met mine, it felt like he was saying something without words. David, oblivious, joked about how Jerome and I should open a restaurant together. "You'd make a great team," he said, laughing. Jerome raised his glass, his eyes fixed on me. "I'd like that." The words were innocent enough, but the way he said them sent a shiver down my spine. That night stuck with me long after we left. The way Jerome looked at me, the way he spoke, it all felt charged, like an undercurrent just waiting to surface. David, meanwhile, remained completely unaware, chatting on the drive home about how often we should have Jerome over. "He's a great guy," David said, his voice filled with enthusiasm. And he clearly likes you. I nearly choked on my breath. What's that supposed to mean? David let out a casual laugh, the kind that almost felt dismissive. Just that you two seem to get along really well. Isn't that a good thing? I didn't respond. Instead, I stared out the window, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to scream at him for being so blind. Or was he? Maybe this had been his intention all along, the very plan he'd hinted at weeks ago. The following morning, my phone buzzed with a message from Jerome. Had a great time last night. You looked stunning, by the way. I froze, my heart pounding. This was the first time he had said something openly flirtatious, and it felt like a line had been crossed. I should have ignored it, shut it down immediately, but instead, I found myself typing back. Thanks, Jerome. Dinner was amazing. You're an incredible cook. I told myself it was just a polite response, nothing serious. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. After that, our messages became more frequent. Inside jokes, little compliments, and casual updates about our days. Nothing physical, but emotionally, I felt like I was treading dangerous ground. One evening, while David was out running errands, Jerome called. The moment I heard his voice on the other end, I felt an unexpected rush of intimacy, one I wasn't prepared for. Hope I'm not bothering you, he said, his tone smooth and warm. Not at all, I replied, though my stomach was twisting in knots. We talked for nearly an hour, covering everything and nothing at all. By the end of the call, I felt both exhilarated and guilty, a mixture I couldn't shake. When David returned home, he noticed something was off right away. You okay? He asked, setting down the grocery bags. Yeah, just tired, I lied, avoiding his gaze. He studied me for a moment. You sure? You seem distracted. I'm fine, I insisted, forcing a smile. David let it go, but his concern lingered. For all his flaws, for all his strange ideas, he still cared about me. And yet, here I was, engaging in conversations I knew he wouldn't approve of. The next time David brought up Jerome, it wasn't about dinner or cooking. It was something much more unsettling. You know, he began, sitting beside me on the couch. Jerome told me he thinks you're incredible. My heart skipped a beat. He said that? David nodded, his expression unreadable. He admires you, your kindness, your sense of humor. He said you have this way of making people feel at ease. I wasn't sure how to respond. Was this David's way of nudging me closer to Jerome, or was he just relaying a compliment? Then he said something that left me speechless. I think you should spend some time with him. Just the two of you. I stared at him, my throat dry. What are you saying? David leaned back, his expression calm, almost detached. I trust you, and I think this could be good for us. For you. At first, I thought he was joking, but the look in his eyes told me he was completely serious. David, I said, my voice shaking, this isn't normal. Couples don't do this. Some do, he countered, his tone even, and it makes them stronger. I was at a loss for words. Part of me wanted to shout at him, to tell him he was insane. But another part, a part I wasn't ready to acknowledge, wondered if he was right. David's suggestion haunted me for days. Every time I thought about it, my stomach twisted. How could he possibly think this was a good idea? And why was he so determined? I tried to push it out of my mind, but Jerome wasn't making it easy. His texts became more frequent, more personal. He'd ask how my day was, send photos of meals he was making, and occasionally drop compliments that felt far less casual than before. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room, scrolling through my phone, another message from Jerome lit up the screen. I can't stop thinking about the way you smiled at dinner the other night. You have this energy about you that's hard to ignore. I stared at the words, my pulse quickening. This wasn't innocent anymore, and I knew it. I started typing, Jerome, I don't think this is appropriate. Before I could press send, David walked into the room. Who are you texting? He asked, glancing at my phone. No one, I said quickly, locking the screen and setting it aside. David gave me a curious look but didn't press further. Instead, he sat beside me. Jerome mentioned he might stop by this weekend, he said. I told him it was fine. My chest tightened. David, you're pushing this too far. He met my gaze, his expression calm but firm. Am I? Or are you just afraid of what this could mean for us? I stood, unable to listen to another justification for something that felt so fundamentally wrong. I'm not afraid of anything, I said. I just don't understand why you think this is okay. David sighed, running a hand through his hair. I just want us to be happy, to explore things we've never considered before. You said yourself that things have felt routine lately. Routine, sure. Life had its monotony, but that didn't mean I was willing to risk my marriage for some reckless experiment. The tension between us lingered for days. By the time the weekend arrived, I felt like I was standing at the edge of a precipice, caught between loyalty and temptation. When Jerome arrived that Saturday, I was a bundle of nerves. He greeted David with a firm handshake, but when his eyes met mine, his smile was different, softer, more knowing. As the evening went on, David seemed determined to create a comfortable atmosphere. He encouraged Jerome and me to sit together while he busied himself in the kitchen. At one point, Jerome leaned in slightly and murmured, You seem tense. Are you okay? I forced a smile. I'm fine, but I wasn't. I felt like I was trapped in a situation that was spiraling beyond my control. When David finally rejoined us, he held up a bottle of wine. Let's make a toast, he said, pouring 3 glasses. To new experiences. Jerome's eyes flickered toward me as he clinked his glass against mine. To new experiences. The rest of the evening was a blur. David appeared completely at ease, while I felt like I was suffocating. By the time Jerome left, I was emotionally drained. That night, as I lay in bed beside David, I couldn't hold it in any longer. "Why are you doing this?" I whispered, my voice breaking. David turned to me, his expression soft. "Because I love you, and I think this could bring us closer, closer." The word echoed in my mind as tears welled in my eyes. How could something that felt so wrong possibly bring us closer? I barely slept. My thoughts spun in endless circles, replaying everything David had said. "I love you, and I think this could bring us closer." Closer to what? To disaster? The next morning, I woke up feeling like I was drowning. David acted as if nothing had happened, making coffee and chatting about his plans for the day. Meanwhile, I sat in a daze, staring at the table. Then, as if on cue, my phone buzzed. "Good morning, beautiful. I hope today brings you as much joy as you bring others." I stared at the message, my stomach twisting. This was too much, too far. It had to stop. I typed back, "Jerome, we need to talk." His reply was immediate. "Of course. When and where?" After a brief hesitation, I responded, "Today, somewhere public, coffee shop." We agreed to meet that afternoon at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. I didn't tell David. I didn't even know how to explain it to him without making everything worse. When I arrived, Jerome was already there, seated at a table by the window, waiting. He stood the moment he saw me, his smile warm and welcoming. "Thanks for meeting me," he said, as I settled into my seat. I nodded, inhaling deeply. "Jerome, we need to clear the air." He tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "About what?" "You know what?" I said, my voice unsteady. "The texts, the calls. It's starting to feel like more than just friendly conversation." Jerome leaned back in his chair, his gaze unwavering. "And what if it is?" His words struck me like a punch to the gut. I had expected him to dismiss it, to brush it off as something harmless, but his honesty left me speechless. "I'm married," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. "To a man who seems determined to push us together for reasons I don't understand." His expression softened. "I know, and I respect that. But I also know what I feel when I'm with you, and I think you feel it too." My heart pounded as I stared at him, torn between frustration, confusion, and something I refused to acknowledge. "I can't do this," I said, shaking my head. "Whatever this is, it isn't right." Jerome leaned forward, his voice quiet but earnest. "I'm not asking you to do anything you're not ready for. I just want you to know that I'm here for you, whatever you need." His words were both a comfort and a temptation, and I hated how much they affected me. "I need space," I finally said, standing abruptly. "Please don't contact me anymore." Jerome gave a solemn nod. "I understand." As I walked out of the cafe, I felt an odd mix of relief and regret. I had drawn a line, but I wasn't sure how long I could keep it intact. When I got home, David was waiting for me, his arms crossed, a knowing look in his eyes. You met with him, didn't you? His voice was calm but firm. My stomach dropped. How do you know? I saw the messages, he said simply, and I wanted to see what you'd do. A wave of anger and betrayal surged through me. You were testing me, spying on me? David shook his head. I wasn't spying. I was trying to understand. And now I see that you're struggling with this just as much as I am. Struggling with what? I snapped. You're the one who started all of this. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I wanted to shake things up, to break us out of this rut we've been stuck in. But maybe I went about it the wrong way. His words lingered between us, and for the first time, I saw something different in his eyes. Hesitation, uncertainty. I love you, he said softly. I just want us to be happy. Can you believe that? I didn't know how to respond. Everything felt so tangled, so far from the life we had built together. Then stop pushing, I finally said, my voice trembling. Let me figure this out on my own. David nodded, the weight of emotion heavy in his expression. Okay, I'll back off. But please, don't shut me out. I turned away, unable to face him any longer. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. David kept his promise, giving me space, but his presence still lingered like a shadow. Every time I looked at him, I felt the weight of everything left unsaid. And then there was Jerome. Even though I had asked him not to reach out, I couldn't stop thinking about him. His words, his warmth, the way he made me feel noticed in a way I hadn't in years. One night, as I sat alone in the living room, mindlessly scrolling through my phone, I stumbled across an old picture of David and me. It was from the early days of our marriage, before things became complicated, before life dulled the spark we once had. I stared at the image, my eyes brimming with tears. What had happened to us? How had we gotten to this point? The next morning, I woke up with a sense of resolve. No more avoiding, no more running. It was time to confront everything. David, Jerome, and most importantly, myself. I started with David. We need to talk, I said, standing in the kitchen doorway as he poured his coffee. He looked up, his expression a mix of hope and apprehension. Okay, I'm listening. I took a deep breath, my hands trembling. I can't do this anymore. The pushing, the expectations, the mind games. It's not us, or at least it's not who I want us to be. David set his mug down, his face suddenly serious. I was only trying to help, to give us something new. I know, I said, my voice breaking. But you never stopped to ask how it made me feel. You never considered if it was something I wanted. His shoulders sagged, and he nodded slowly. You're right. I didn't. And I'm sorry. The apology caught me off guard. For the first time in weeks, I felt like we were finally on the same page. I need to rebuild this with you, I said, tears slipping down my face. but on our terms, not anyone else's. David stepped forward, wrapping his arms around me. We'll figure it out, he whispered. Together. It was a small moment, but it felt monumental. Later that day, I knew I had one last conversation to have, this time with Jerome. I sent him a message, asking if we could meet one last time. He agreed. We met at the same cafe where this whirlwind had truly begun. When I arrived, Jerome greeted me with a soft smile, but there was a sadness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. I didn't think I'd hear from you again, he said as I sat down. I took a deep breath, my pulse quickening. Jerome, I care about you. I really do. But this, whatever it is between us, it has to stop. He nodded slowly, his gaze steady. I understand. But can I ask you something? Of course, I said cautiously. Do you think you would have felt the same way if things were different? If the circumstances weren't what they are? His question hit me like a freight train. The truth was, I didn't know. But it didn't matter. What mattered was the life I had chosen, the vows I had made. I don't know, I admitted honestly, but I can't live in what ifs. I have to focus on what's real. Jerome smiled faintly, though sadness still lingered in his expression. You're stronger than you realize. As I walked out of the cafe, I felt an overwhelming mix of relief and heartbreak. Letting go wasn't easy, but it was necessary. When I got home, David was waiting for me. He didn't ask where I'd been, and I didn't offer an explanation. Instead, we sat down together, side by side, and for the first time in a long time, we began the slow process of rebuilding what we had almost lost.